Former President Donald Trump gets a split decision in the civil case brought by writer E. Jean Caroll, who accused him of raping her in a department store dressing room in 1996. The 9-member jury deciding that there was an attack, finding Trump not liable for rape, but liable for sexual abuse, battery, and defamation, and awarding a total of $5 million in damages to Caroll. A verdict Trump's lead lawyer, Joe Tacopina, calls perplexing.
Strange verdict. This was a rape claim. It was a rape case all along, and the jury rejected that, but made other findings. So we'll obviously be appealing those other findings.
Trump calls the verdict a disgrace and the continuation of the greatest political witch hunt in history. Despite several ongoing investigations, he's been the Republican frontrunner in many polls as he tries to take back the White House. Yesterday's verdict in the civil case comes after Trump was indicted on felony counts in a hush money investigation.
Well, this is a guy who's been through a lot of different scandals and controversies throughout the course of his political career, and he's always found a way to power through.
Republican strategist Colin Reed.
Usually in unconventional means and methods. And he's got some of the most loyal and largest followings around of anyone, left, right, or center. So I'm sure he'll have a robust response. And for someone who's leading in all of his party's polls and has had a string of fairly good political news in recent days, this is certainly not what you want to be dealing with if you're a campaign. But this is a guy who's no stranger to unhelpful political narratives and the need to fight through them.
Does this help Florida governor and potential candidate Ron DeSantis? Does it help President Biden? Who are the winners and losers from this verdict, potentially?
Well, on the Republican side, there's a growing contingent of voters who are always with the former president, and there's a group who are never going to be with the former president, and then there's a wide swath of folks in the middle who are interested in exploring other options. And right now, the overwhelming majority of them are with Governor DeSantis because he's the most viable alternative, but he's not even an announced candidate yet, and he's had his challenges as of late. And I would watch those voters because they are apt to swing to other potential vehicles and vessels as someone who Republicans believe are best equipped to replace President Biden. It's not as though President Biden's gone through a good stretch himself. The polling from ABC and the Washington Post that turned so many heads, and I mean, those were abysmal numbers. And he's got time to turn it around, but that clock is ticking.
Republican National Committee Chair Ronna McDaniel says she expects voters to be focused on issues, not investigations.
I think a lot of Americans want the focus to come back to them and the issues that matter in their lives, and they don't want to continue to see this investigation after investigation after investigation that we've seen for now over 6 years.
Focusing on issues, though, like the border and parents' rights and crime, didn't seem to work in the 2022 midterms for Republicans.
Right. The 2022 midterms offer a number of instructive lessons to be learned for the party going forward. Number one, we've got to have a message that's more than just Joe Biden's horrible. Voters are seeing that. They're already kind of getting that, and they don't need any more convincing on that. They're sold. So these candidates that are forming, they're going to need to put forward what it is they stand for and offer voters more than just being not Biden and not the Democrats, because we tried that before and it didn't work out the way Republicans had hoped.
What about the current standoff over the debt limit, which is something that the White House, has repeatedly blamed on Republicans, saying that they should, agree to a clean raising of the debt limit and set aside the spending cut debate for after?
Yeah, it seems to me the White House has been underestimating Speaker McCarthy and his ability to corral and get his caucus to pass a piece of legislation that does raise the debt ceiling. But they did. The House Republicans acted. They put forward a piece of legislation. They moved the hot potato court over to President Biden in the Senate. And their position has thus far been, well, we're not going to negotiate. I think that's something that the American public can see through. I don't think anyone wants to see a default. No one wants to see us go over the fiscal cliff. But it's also becoming untenable just to believe that the status quo is going to work as well.
What about the White House just hammering this message of extreme Republicans and MAGA Republicans controlling the party's agenda? Are you concerned as a Republican strategist that this is going to resonate with voters, that is going to stick since they're hitting it so early and so often?
Well, first, it's pretty ironic that the candidate who pledged to unite America and bring us all together has now resorted to just labeling half the country as extreme. Well, what else can you do when you've got 36% approval, when you think the 32% of voters believe you have the mental sharpness for another 4 years, and 58% of your own party want somebody else to be nominated as your president? You have to attack and disqualify. And my guess is if these numbers continue in the trajectory they have, and if President Biden isn't able to get into a better political standing, you're going to start hearing some serious discussions about some other potential candidates on the Democratic side, because running as an incumbent with a 46% approval rating, that would be concerning, let alone 36, which is, if you believe this latest poll, where the current president is at.
One other thing, I mean, is it fair to say that if it is a Trump-Biden rematch, that the now president will be facing a different Donald Trump in some way because of the multiple investigations, including an indictment in a hush money case and now this verdict?
Time will tell. No political candidate, if they're being honest with you, wants to be dealing with legal challenges. But look, Donald Trump is nothing if unpredictable, and that's been part of his appeal. But I also think that for the last three elections from 2018, 2020, the Republican Party has not done well up or down the ballot. And it's time for Republicans who want to change from direction of President Biden to make that compelling vision.
For President Biden, the clock is ticking on two key issues. One is the debt limit. He had an Oval Office meeting with the House and Senate leaders yesterday, but remains in a standoff over Republican calls to cut spending. The other issue is the surge of migrants at the southern border, expected to get even worse when the COVID-era restriction known as Title 42 ends tomorrow.
We're doing all we can.
The president says it's going to be chaotic for a while and says that during yesterday's meeting, he raised border agents as an example of concerns about spending cuts. His approval rating hitting a new low, 36% overall in a recent Washington Post ABC News poll, also sinking among key groups, including Black people, women, and moderates. Democratic strategist and co-host of The Five, Jessica Tarlov, says that poll has been an outlier on some fronts, but she acknowledges concern.
I do think that overall there have been little messages that have been coming in, especially when it comes to Ron DeSantis. There were a number of polls from Republican pollsters like WPEA Intelligence and Echelon Insights that had President Biden beating Donald Trump, but losing to Ron DeSantis in key swing states. So this has kind of been buzzing in their ear. And I would always rather run an election thinking we could lose rather than it's going to be a cakewalk, because we saw what happened in 2016. And that's actually the background of the 2022 midterms. Remember, everyone was going on about this red wave that didn't end up coming because Democrats took the threat seriously and made sure that we got out the vote, specifically the youth vote. So it's serious, but I don't at all feel like the Democratic campaign is doomed.
What about his support among Democrats, among independents, for instance, though, to the extent that he may have some wobbling there, for lack of a better term? I mean, what can his campaign do about it? Because if he tries to cater too much to the center, could he then risk losing more votes from certain groups?
So I tend to think that it's unclear or hard to predict what will cause President Biden to lose any supporters until we know who's on the other side of this. Because if it's Donald Trump, it's just a very different game than if it's insert generic Republican. And I happen to think that most of these generic Republicans have gone really off the deep end in terms of moving to the right. But you know that a Ron DeSantis is going to poll differently than a Donald Trump is, just with how polarizing Trump is. So there's always a danger of losing voters, but it really is dependent on what the Republicans do on the other side. So all of whatever policy positions they end up coming with, I think is going to be really determinant of who will stick with President Biden or who might shift over to the Republicans.
The president is facing some Democrat criticism, at least from Senator Joe Manchin, over the debt limit standoff. Do you think he should be doing anything to handle it differently?
So I was in favor of taking the meetings, like always take the meeting, right? That's what anyone tells you. There have been Democrats who worked in the Obama administration, because remember, Obama negotiated once and he had a shutdown once. And I think it was Dan Pfeiffer said that having the shutdown, not negotiating, was actually the better approach to it. They ended up getting more of what they wanted when it was eventually negotiated because they showed that they were willing to do that. Now, I don't know if the American public is going to feel the same way about it. And I would still entertain proposals that are coming out of the GOP conference. But the things that they're putting forward are not with anything that he would sign.
Republicans are calling the situation on the southern border a crisis. They have for a long time. The White House says it has a robust plan for the end of Title 42, while also essentially blaming the Trump administration and Congress for the state of the immigration system. How much could a new influx of migrants hurt the president, though? And I ask that in part because there's a new Reuters Ipsos poll where only 26% approve of the president's handling of immigration. Yeah. So it seems like he's getting some blame, even if the White House says it's not his fault.
Yeah. And I mean, I always thought that was an absurd tack to take. Title 42, which was a public health emergency, obviously we are past that, thankfully, did serve a good function in terms of holding people back. And he will get blamed for this. The question will just be whether this issue actually matters to voters come November 2024. I think it has the potential to, at the very least, be a good talking point for the Republican side. And, sitting on a big humanitarian disaster is no good for anybody, obviously for the people involved and then for the president politically.
One thing that hasn't seemed to affect the president so far is the Hunter Biden investigation. Yeah. Do you think enough voters will ever care enough about that for it to make a difference in the election, or is it baked in?
Oh, I don't think that they're nearly on the scale of the kind of baked in issues that President Trump has. And there could be more to come, but I don't think that they're comparable. In terms of the Hunter Biden saga affecting the president, unless a straight line is drawn from what Hunter Biden was doing to the president, I don't think that it'll make any difference to the American public. And honestly, people are just so turned off by politicians in general. I don't think that anyone really believes in the character of them all that much, which I think is a very sad reality, but it's the reality nonetheless.
While I have you, I just wanted to touch on Senate races. There are predictions already, again, of an uphill battle for Democrats. Yeah. How can Democrats win in states like West Virginia, Ohio, Montana, Arizona? What do you envision as key parts of the strategy for Democrats?
West Virginia is going to be really tough. And I talked about this a lot around the midterms, that we desperately needed the wins that we got because looking ahead, the 2024 map was just terrible. And we have some of the best candidates we could hope to run, like a John Tester in Montana, Sherrod Brown, who's been, I think, the only, if one of two, successful Democrats in Ohio, which is basically a red state. So I'm very worried about the Senate map. I think that the Democrats could regain the House, but uphill battle is a very generous way to describe what will be going on in the Senate.
Jessica Tarlov, co-host of The Five and Democratic strategist. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.